Okay, we have some time for questions and discussions, and we do have microphones on either side of the room, and if people would come to the mic, I think I'd appreciate that. It would make it easier. I might just start out with a question, actually, for you, Holly, and that's about this TMDL approach that's been taken for the Tampa Bay, and the fact that, which has been really a wonderful way of taking a problem like nitrogen that has a multiplicity of sources, and that obviously all impact one resource. But how are you going to be, or how is the area going to be able to factor in growth as things move forward, since no matter how efficient the sewage treatment plants are, there's still going to be more nitrogen put out by growing communities, and people may be moving into areas in the watershed that aren't covered by these fertilizer laws, and so, you know, how do you, or is this, you don't want to just have another set point back to 1950 and then gradual degradation back to 70 as you grow. So how do you deal with that?
I think that there's a couple of different things that happened in Tampa Bay that, again, I think are quite unique. One of them is that the TMDL is the same as the nitrogen management goal. And so EPA and DEP, or the state DEP, both accepted the science and also the goals that were established in a voluntary way as the regulatory limit. Also, the EPA and DEP both allowed the consortium, public-private consortium, to define how they would best allocate those goals throughout the. So there was a lot of buy-in from all the different partners there, all the point sources and non-point sources in the area. In terms of managing growth, we're looking at implementing projects that can offset new growth, and that is a requirement that each one of the permitted point sources now have, and non-point sources, all the permitted sources. If they need to have additional allocation over their 2003 cap, they have to show a reduction someplace else, an offset. And they do it in a lot of different ways. Some of them are doing it with additional stormwater treatment. The fertilizer ordinance is another one. The electric utilities are actually reducing emissions and generating credits, if you will. Now, we don't have a trade system in place.
You don't have trading,
we don't.
And would you have they discussed trading? Because that has been one thing that's been suggested. Why not allow people to sell their permits as with sulfur? But it would have to be kind of a local market. But have they discussed that?
They have, and right now in the state of Florida, their trading is not allowed except in Jacksonville. So we're not allowed to trade right now, but the partners are starting to evaluate that. They are allowed to transfer between two different point sources within a drainage basin, so that if a wastewater treatment plant, for instance, goes to reuse and generates some credits, they're allowed to transfer that with another source within the watershed. But it's a one-on-one. It's not a market-based, and those negotiations are up to those two individuals that then have to be approved by the regulatory agencies.
Dick?
Thank you both very much. I'm Richard Jackson at UCLA. Holly, your comment about citizen involvement reminds me of a talk that Ryan Gravel, who is the fellow behind the Beltline in Atlanta, gave to my class one day, and the students asked, what was the most important thing? And he said, oh, far and away the most important thing is the public really wanted it. And the politicians, no one could back away from that system. So it reinforces your point about people really want clean water. I'd like you, in a minute, if you don't mind, to talk more about the sources. When I was in Atlanta, I was there about 10 years, Gwinnett County grew by 300,000 households. There was not a single sewage treatment plant. This is an area of about 5 million people that depended on a river that you could throw a baseball across, and yet they weren't capturing any of the wastewater, treating it and putting it back into the supply, which is very important to Florida and the Gulf as well, as you know. But it made me think more about the sources of nitrogen in a broader sense. The power plants put a lot of nitrous oxides and whatever out. And as so many of the things we do have multiple impacts. For example, we put catalytic converters on cars, and nitrogen oxides drop dramatically when we do this. Do we in any way get credit for not nitrifying the bay? And it would be interesting to look at the catalytic converters and some of that decline in nitrogen and the import. You didn't mention how much septic there is, because it's a disaster, and we ought to just capture this as a public health statement. People believe I need to have my independent home and I can have this all by ourselves. But the truth is, if there's a public system, it is maintained and managed, and the water is recaptured. Since I'm the guy from California right now, I want to announce to everyone that cap and trade for greenhouse gases has been put in place. Beginning today, the auctioning will occur in California. So with that, I will stop. Thanks.
Our response to that, Holly? Don't have to.
Yes, I think in Tampa Bay, we do have pockets of septic systems, but most, because it is quite urbanized, most of our residential areas are now on central sewage. Certainly one of the major sources of bacteriological contamination are some of the old package plants that associated with trailer parks and very old communities. And those remain a target, high target for both nitrogen and for public health reasons.
Bernie.
Bernie Goldstein, University of Pittsburgh. Ed, you did such a superb job of describing the whole problem of biomarkers, what they mean, and how do you translate them to something that's obviously of public value, with keeping beaches clean. But I wonder if the implication of the variability data is perhaps as strong, and perhaps you just didn't present this part of it. First, you made a great case that 104 is not a magic number. It's not 103 is fine, and 105 is definitely going to make you sick. It's the best predictive number we can get. You showed that we're sort of chasing after the exceedances, that the day after the exceedance on this beach, you gave us about a month worth of data, the levels were within the standard when the beach was closed. But yet, the third highest level in that 1 month of data of bacteria was one of the days in which the beach was closed, was the day after an episode of above 104. And it seems to me that if we accept that 104 is not magic, could be less, could be more, that there's some risk, as you pointed out, at the level below, then the real question is, once you exceed 104, does that predict the next day's level is going to be higher than the background level? And I don't know that you showed us that data. That's the data I'd like to know, is to, once it's up above the standard, is that predicting a higher level of bacteria the next day? Not necessarily that it's going to exceed the magic standard.
Yeah, I don't know that anyone has, specifically looked at that issue. There is obviously a cost associated with shutting down a recreational beach, and so the authorities are very sensitive to this. If you look at money, typically in these beach environments, there's a longshore current system, and so what was there today is going to be down current tomorrow. And now, if there is a source continuously leaking into the system, then you would expect that what's there today will probably be there tomorrow, because the input is continuous. But the actual water is gone with a longshore current system. If it's episodic, then it may very well not be there the next day. So it depends on the nature of the input, I think.
Thank you.
I have a question for Holly. I really enjoyed your talk. It's fabulous to see an environmental success, and I congratulate you on doing that. That's just wonderful. And I've been very interested in how we can monetize or quantify monetarily what ecosystem services are. Something Ed mentioned from the Costanza paper, and there's, as we all know, that led to immense debate among economists, and yet they're still trying to play the same game and figure this out. So when you mentioned, I think that you had 25 million kilograms of N, is that right, being removed by your habitats per year? You had 25 capital M kg.
Yes.
Okay. And then I thought you were pricing that out at $8 per pound of N. Is that right? So if I multiply all that, that's 400 million a year. Am I wrong, or is that how you came up with your value?
The valuation was done by ORD, so I would have to go back and ask
okay.
them specifically that. But yeah, I think the 400 million might be the higher rate rather than the lower rate. So yeah, you know, it can be significant.
Are those numbers published someplace so I could cite
They're
them?
in review right now.
Okay.
And
I will keep looking. Thank you.
Thanks for that. John?
Thank you for two interesting talks. One of the things that is going to be a growingly important issue in terms of climate change adaptation is sensitive wastewater infrastructure in coastal areas. And I think of places like, you know, the Blue Plains water treatment plant in the Potomac, which looks like it's about 1 foot above the current tidal Potomac. And if we ever had a surge up the Potomac like they had in Staten Island and in Brooklyn, we would be without wastewater services in Washington, D.C. probably for weeks or months. And I'm just wondering, in your world, are there, you know, and the other thing that's kind of going concurrently is a lot of urban wastewater infrastructure that is moving towards a more natural, quote unquote, system, the use of ecosystem services and ecological wastewater treatment in a built environment. And I'm wondering, in your world and in Tampa, you know, which is going to have the sea level rise issue, are people looking at hybrid, you know, not having this rigid infrastructure, or are we just going to have to build wastewater plants, you know, 20 feet above the current sea level?
Well, an interesting example of that kind of problem was in New Orleans after Katrina. I mean, the principal wastewater treatment plant for the city of New Orleans went underwater. And the time frame to bring that back online was a couple months. Typically, the wastewater treatment plants are at the low point because that way the sewage flows to the plant, not back the other way, which of course is not what you want. It's a problem, and it could be resolved by putting some kind of a barrier around the wastewater treatment plant. I mean, it's not, you know, high tech to do that. But if you don't want, you make a good point. The wastewater treatment plants are right there in harm's way. They're going to go underwater if there's a storm surge or anything analogous to that, a hurricane comes through. It'd be easy enough to provide a defense to prevent that sort of thing from happening. But and you'd think, for heaven's sake, New Orleans would be a case where they might think of doing that, but they haven't. I mean, if you go to that wastewater treatment plant, it's sitting right there unprotected.
So Ed, you had a question for Holly. Maybe this is a good time.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Holly a question. I think of Chesapeake Bay as you were talking, and last time I looked, they were nowhere near their goal in terms of getting the benthic grasses to recover, and I wonder, why is that? Is there something about Chesapeake Bay that makes it particularly problematic, or could they learn from the Tampa Bay experience?
I've actually talked a lot with Tampa Bay and was on the panel, the Academy panel looking at the TMDL for the Chesapeake Bay, and Tampa Bay came up a number of times in that discussion. I think a major, there's a couple of different things about Tampa than about Chesapeake. One of them is that all of our population and our 2.3 million people see the bay almost every day. You know, and so it's not like a huge watershed that goes way up into New York, you know, from Chesapeake Bay. So I think the public message is a lot stronger, you know, in Tampa and in estuaries and coasts where much of the population interacts somehow with the bay, you know, on a pretty regular basis. And I think another piece of that is scale. Chesapeake Bay is many times larger than Tampa Bay. Now, Tampa Bay is not small. It's not a small estuary, but it's like the upper part of Chesapeake Bay. And so it seems like Chesapeake Bay does have, I mean, there's some successes in Chesapeake Bay, but they're smaller scale, you know, and so I'm thinking that scale issue is really important. So those two things really came up as elements that were different in Tampa than in the Chesapeake.
I mean, I'll add another factor, and there's somebody from EPA, Al McGartland, could probably articulate it better, and I'll ask you to add, but you're talking about several jurisdictions that are involved in the watershed and would all need to agree to take certain actions, some of whom never see the bay. But Al, I don't know.
I think you hit it right there. EPA's challenge with how to get coordinated action among all the states all at once. I'm happy to say that process is moving forward, so we'll have to wait and see. The other thing, at least I'm not an economist, I'm not the the seagrass person, but they mentioned flooding as well as a big setback. Is that of last year and the so? It's Al McGartland from EPA, so,
Roundtable member. Yeah, and so the Chesapeake, it's the way that authority for these environmental issues is allocated to state and local communities, which is probably a strength for Tampa Bay, where the local community can join together and do this, is a weakness for managing something like the Chesapeake.
Can I just put on a microphone and add a comment? I would imagine that Chesapeake Bay has a much higher proportion of non-point sources. To some extent, your problem is Maurice and South, but most of your sources were point sources.
I think that is also true. So, like you mentioned, people see the bay every day. Well, the Pennsylvania, which has a pretty large percentage of the total loadings, a lot of it coming from Pennsylvania agriculture, they don't see the bay at all. So they do see the Susquehanna and local lake and river water quality, which is one of our anchors. Right.
Right. So I think, did you have a comment on this point? Did you want to add in on the Chesapeake? I think he
Certainly
might.
don't want to step in front of it here, but it seems like the Tampa Bay proposal is about saving water quality, it's about saving swimming, it's about saving fishing. And with the Chesapeake Bay, it's been save the bay. And it's been necessarily an externalized factor. And in my work, when talking to people, it hasn't been given that human face of, let's save the things that we care about, which is specifically the ecosystem services. And that's led to a lot of passion and support for Save the Bay, but not really an actionable cause. And just an opportunity to point that out, sir. Step in front.
Yeah, having been involved
Yeah.
in seagrasses in Chesapeake Bay for years now, and having been involved in some of the local issues, one of the issues facing the bay, that Chesapeake Bay, because of that large watershed, that multiple state jurisdiction and local jurisdiction, is also the issue of land use management. And it's land use management from a variety of sources. As I watch the recreational and commercial anglers fighting with each other, I keep saying to them, but you're fighting over an ever-decreasing piece of the pie, when if you were addressing the externalities, the land use management issues, you might in fact be able to grow the pie and you wouldn't have to fight so hard with each other unless you would just enjoy that. And those issues are multiple, because if you fly over the bay, as I have on many occasions doing surveys, you'll see that even though it's against the law, you have farms that are plowed right down to the water's edge, and you don't have anyone explaining to them the value of conservation tillage. The other thing is, residents will have fertilization and lawns right down to the edge of the bay. You also have riprap rather than living shorelines. But in addition to that, you have multiple urban areas. And what they've done is they've produced urban sprawl with hardscapes, and you get a storm, and that mobilizes all of the pollutants off of the concrete, and it mobilizes sediments into the bay. And all of that has been very, very damaging, and a very hard message, because people don't want to deal with things like permeable pavements. They're more expensive to put in, and they don't necessarily understand the value of it. So there's a great deal of work to be done in Chesapeake Bay watershed.
I think we should capture that point, that that the services to people in terms of health and well-being really haven't been captured. and many of these efforts, as wonderful as they have been. Dick?
I promise to be brief. I will suspect that 30 years from now, if you tell a child that we used to irrigate our lawns with drinking water, they'll say that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And what are the implications of going to, we call it purple pipe in California, using recycled water for irrigation? I mean, it's already got a little nitrogen in it, and it would recharge groundwater and probably be denitrified in the process. Have you begun to move at all towards a lot more wastewater, not wastewater, but treated water capture?
Yes, in Tampa Bay, it's, I would say that probably 70 to 80% of our wastewater treatment plants now have at least some reclaimed water. Now, one of the issues there is that the piping to get it out to, especially residential areas, is very expensive. And one of the reasons that one of the large cities in the Tampa Bay area, St. Petersburg, was able to go to 100% reuse in the 1980s, again, was this Clean Water Act funds that were available at the time. I think without those, we would not have seen that because of the expense of just the infrastructure that it takes. Some of our more rural areas are trying to use the wastewater for irrigation for crops, for some of the agricultural crops in the area, and which is, we do have a water supply issue in Tampa Bay as well as a water quality issue, and so the more reuse we can use, the better off. One of the issues associated with using wastewater in irrigation for crops, even if they're not leafy crops that are eaten directly, is that there's a high amount of dissolved solids in the wastewater that our irrigation systems now use a microjet irrigation, and it clogs those pores. And so there has to be an extra step of filtering the wastewater before it can be used for irrigation for agricultural areas that use this microjet irrigation. And so, you know, there's a lot of trade-offs there, but I think due to the amount of focus on water use and water, we do have water use caution areas where we have limits on the amount of groundwater and surface water that can be used. And coupled with the desire to reduce nitrogen by recycling it as reclaimed water, that certainly is something that continues to be an important part of the long-term nitrogen management strategy for Tampa Bay.
Yeah, let me just make a couple of comments there. I think one of the issues with using the water, recycling the water in that way, is that the wastewater treatment plants have not been located with that idea in mind. They've been located nearest to the most convenient place to discharge the water. But now that this idea is on the radar screen, you find that, for example, in Hawaii, you have expensive resorts where you can go and play golf, and the entire golf course is irrigated with wastewater from the resort. It makes a lot of sense. But you look at the principal wastewater treatment plant for the city of Honolulu, there's about 2 golf courses nearby, and that's it. It's, you know, it's just not in a place that's convenient, and you're talking about pumping water uphill, which is expensive. You have a very different scenario with sludge, a lot of which is recycled in the U.S. because they can't just throw it away. It has to be trucked off at worst to a landfill. And as long as you're going to put it in a truck, why not take it someplace where it can be put to good use? So the recycling of sludge in the U.S. is a much higher percentage than the recycling of the liquid effluent.
Thank you for that. I'm struck by the fact that we don't have the infrastructure to separately distribute reuse water and drinking water, but yet we do have the infrastructure for delivering drinking water to people, 1 polycarbonate bottle at a time. So that's kind of interesting. And people pay for it very happily. Yeah, they pay a lot for it. So I think that we've reached a good time for our break. We were scheduled to break until 10:50 when we're coming back for our next session. Urge you to come back on time. We've got 20 minutes, so plenty of time to stretch and talk. See you back here.
I had the class to